The sun had barely crested the distant ridge that framed Silver Pines when the first signs of conflict began to stir beneath the manicured peace of the affluent subdivision. It was a neighborhood that prided itself on strict order, where lawns were trimmed with military precision, fences stood at uniform height, and mailbox designs had to be approved by a committee. From a distance, it looked like a postcard from suburban heaven. But beneath the surface, the power structure was ruled not by fairness or community spirit, but by the cold iron grip of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association. And at the center of it all stood Travis Denton, a man who had twisted the HOA's authority into a personal fiefdom. Denton, a former mall security guard who never quite let go of his dreams of law enforcement glory, had transformed himself into a self-appointed compliance officer, complete with a knockoff tactical vest, steel-toe boots, a police-style utility belt, and a sidearm he had no legal right to carry. He referred to himself in the third person, Officer Denton, and made it his mission to enforce the HOA's strictest codes with theatrical aggression. He'd fined elderly couples for having the wrong shade of beige on their patio furniture, ticketed teenage kids for skateboarding on a public sidewalk, and even once threatened to have a man's car towed for parking half an inch beyond his own driveway. Most people in Silver Pines avoided confrontation. They kept their heads down, paid their fines, and whispered about Travis behind closed doors. That is, until James and Sarah Lane moved into 128 Magnolia Circle. James and Sarah had relocated from 2 counties over, looking for a quieter place to live now that Sarah had accepted her appointment as county sheriff, the youngest in the region's history, and one of the most respected officers in the state. They wanted privacy, peace, and a community where they could enjoy weekends tending to a garden or sipping coffee on the porch. What they hadn't anticipated was finding a neighborhood gripped by the tyrannical shadow of an overzealous, power-hungry HOA enforcer with a hero complex. They'd barely finished unpacking their moving boxes when the first HOA letter arrived, an official notice citing a violation for having unapproved flora in the front yard flower bed. The plants in question? Lavender and rosemary, which Sarah had grown from clippings passed down by her grandmother. She laughed at first, thinking it had to be a clerical error. But James wasn't so sure. The neighbors were polite but guarded. Conversations seemed stiff when the topic of the HOA came up, and one man had visibly tensed when James jokingly asked, "So who's this big bad HOA guy around here?" No one gave a name. No one gave an answer. It wasn't until the following Saturday morning, while Sarah was kneeling beside the flower bed in a t-shirt and jeans, gently planting marigolds next to the lavender, that they met Travis Denton in the flesh. He came stomping up the sidewalk like a mall cop on a power trip, sunglasses glinting and arms pumping with exaggerated purpose. "Ma'am," he barked, stopping just inches from the curb and scanning the yard like a battlefield medic assessing the wounded, "You're in direct violation of HOA Landscaping Code 4.3.2 subsection C. Non-native aromatic plant life in a designated visibility zone." Sarah blinked, unsure whether to laugh or stare. "Excuse me," she asked politely, brushing dirt from her gloves. Travis reached to his belt and produced a clipboard as though it were a badge of rank. "This is a written warning," he announced, holding the paper aloft as though he were citing a criminal offense. James, who had just walked out with 2 mugs of coffee, froze in his tracks, watching from the porch with narrowed eyes. "I'm sorry," Sarah said evenly, still kneeling in the flower bed, "but are you law enforcement?" Travis puffed his chest. "I'm the authorized compliance officer of the Silver Pines HOA. He said. "I maintain order, I ensure safety, and I do not tolerate disregard for community guidelines." Sarah stood slowly, brushing soil from her knees and facing him squarely. "Well, officer," she said with just the faintest edge of sarcasm. "We just moved in, and the only thing we're planting is flowers, not trouble." But Travis wasn't interested in charm. Something about Sarah's calm demeanor seemed to agitate him further. He stepped closer, now just a few feet from her face. "This is your last warning," he snapped. "Next time there will be fines, possibly removal of property." James descended the steps quickly, his tone sharp. "Back up," he said. "You're way out of line." Travis turned toward him, one hand moving to rest on the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. "I suggest you mind your tone, sir," he said. "This is an official HOA matter. Do not interfere." Sarah's eyes instantly locked on the weapon. Her expression didn't change, but her body became still, alert. "Are you licensed to carry that?" she asked, her voice so calm it was chilling. Travis sneered. That's none of your business. James stepped between them now, his instincts on fire. You're pointing a gun at my wife over a flower bed, he snapped. Get off our property. Now. But Travis wasn't finished. In one ill-advised motion, he unlatched the retention strap on his holster and rested his hand firmly on the pistol's grip. You're escalating this, he said, low and threatening. I'll consider this a hostile encounter if you take another step. What happened next happened fast. Sarah, moving with practiced speed and absolute precision, lifted both hands in a slow, disarming gesture. Let's all take a breath, she said. No one needs to get hurt. But I'm telling you, if you draw that weapon, you'll regret it. The calm in her voice wasn't fear. It was warning. Travis didn't see it. He didn't see the way James had already pulled his phone and started recording. He didn't see the subtle shift in Sarah's posture, the defensive stance of a trained officer who had disarmed violent criminals and led hostage negotiations. He saw only a woman standing in her yard challenging his fragile, inflated authority. But something, maybe the tone of her voice or the fire in her eyes, made him hesitate. He muttered something unintelligible, snapped the strap back over the pistol, and stepped back. This isn't over, he snarled. You'll be hearing from the board. Then he turned and stormed off, his boots crunching angrily on the gravel path. The moment he disappeared from view, Sarah let out a slow breath. James stared at her, his face pale. He was going to pull it, he said. He was actually going to draw on you. Sarah nodded, her voice tight. He doesn't know what he almost walked into. She walked back toward the porch, her shoulders tense. He thinks he's in charge here. Thinks he's above the law because no one's challenged him. James followed her, anger boiling in his chest. This guy's a lunatic, he snapped. We should report him. Hell, we should sue him. But Sarah was already thinking several moves ahead. Not yet, she said. We go through official channels and the HOA will just bury it. This kind of abuse doesn't happen in a vacuum. Someone's protecting him, maybe a whole board of people. We need to find out who. James raised an eyebrow. So what do we do? She looked back at him, the sharpness of a strategist in her eyes. We do what I do best, she said. We investigate. That night, after dinner, they sat in their small home office surrounded by unopened boxes and freshly printed HOA bylaws. James had already pulled public records on the board's elected members, 5 individuals, all longtime residents with overlapping connections to a local property management firm. Sarah cross-referenced incident reports from the past year, disproportionate fines, unusual evictions, unexplained citations. The pattern was starting to take shape. Travis wasn't a lone zealot, he was the blunt instrument of a corrupted system, one that had gone unchecked for too long. As the sun dipped low and the lights of Silver Pines flickered on across identical homes and spotless driveways, James and Sarah Lane dug in deep. They weren't just new residents anymore. They were the reckoning this neighborhood didn't know it needed. The days that followed the confrontation between Sarah Lane and Travis Denton were quiet on the surface, but behind the scenes they churned with activity like a volcano simmering beneath the earth. Sarah and James had returned to their daily routines with practiced calm, pretending to be just another suburban couple settling into a new home, all while launching a methodical and increasingly alarming investigation into the true depth of corruption that gripped the Silver Pines Homeowners Association. The files, records, and patterns they began unearthing painted a picture not just of negligence or overreach, but of deliberate, systematic abuse. Sarah worked in layers, drawing on her law enforcement credentials. She pulled state business filings, HOA incorporation documents, and subcontractor licensing records. She filed quiet requests with the county recorder's office, looking into liens filed by the HOA and cross-referencing them with local court dockets. What she found was a mess of selectively enforced violations, unusually high legal fees billed to homeowners, and more than a dozen property foreclosures that smelled more like asset seizures than actual debt resolution. Meanwhile, James took a different approach, diving headlong into the HOA's digital footprint. A seasoned cybersecurity analyst, James had a way of slipping into data streams like a ghost, silent, unnoticed, thorough. Within days, he had cloned the HOA's outdated public website, discovering a poorly secured administrative portal that required little more than a default password to access. What he found inside was staggering: financial ledgers missing entries, disbursements to unnamed third-party vendors, and multiple emails suggesting board-level discussions on how to enforce compliance through strategic pressure. Travis Denton's name came up frequently in internal discussions, not as a rogue actor, but as an external security consultant paid off the books through a landscaping firm owned by the HOA president's cousin. Sarah documented everything, printing, labeling, and organizing the evidence in a growing file that she stored in a locked cabinet in their home office. At night, she and James sat in their living room with laptops open, comparing notes and building timelines. By the end of the week, they had identified not only a pattern of weaponized rule enforcement but also potential criminal activity, embezzlement, wire fraud, harassment, and impersonation of law enforcement. But what disturbed Sarah most wasn't the digital trail, it was the silence of the neighborhood. When she tried to casually chat with neighbors, their responses were clipped, eyes darting nervously before doors closed politely in her face. People were afraid. It wasn't until she found an opportunity to speak with Mr. Richard Collins, a retired Marine who lived 2 houses down, that she got her first direct confirmation of what she already suspected. Collins, a sharp, no-nonsense man in his early 70s, invited her in under the pretense of discussing a shared water meter issue, but once the door was closed, he sat heavily in his recliner and looked Sarah in the eyes. "You law?" he asked without preamble. Sarah hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Sheriff," she replied quietly. Collins sighed and leaned back, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I figured," he said. "You've got the look. That calm when things go sideways. Denton doesn't like that. Makes him nervous. That's why he's been driving by your place after midnight." That admission sent a ripple of tension down Sarah's spine, but she kept her expression neutral. Collins reached under a stack of books beside his chair and pulled out a small USB drive. "I've got cameras all over this place," he said. "Front, back, garage. About 6 months ago, Denton pulled a gun on my grandson for shooting hoops in the driveway. Claimed he was brandishing a projectile. He shook his head in disgust. Kid's 12. I saved the footage in case I ever needed it." Sarah took the drive carefully as if it were radioactive. "Why haven't you reported this?" she asked. Collins gave her a tired smile. "Because the HOA runs the sheriff's office in this neighborhood. Or so they think. Everyone who's tried to fight them ends up buried in fines, liens, or legal fees. They're running a racket." Sarah nodded slowly. Not for long. Later that night, Sarah and James reviewed the footage. It was damning. Travis, decked out in full tactical gear, stood on Collins' property, one hand gripping his holstered weapon as he berated a frightened child for unregulated sports activity. The footage showed the child crying, Collins stepping between them, and Travis threatening to report this violation to the board with a recommendation for punitive fines. It was clear, concise, and legally explosive. Sarah saved the video to 3 separate drives, uploaded it to encrypted cloud storage, and added it to the growing dossier. But they weren't the only ones who were watching. Travis had grown suspicious. His nightly passes by the Lane house had become more frequent, sometimes with his headlights off. James installed additional security cameras around the perimeter and kept a small drone prepped in the garage for silent aerial surveillance. One evening, while monitoring the drone's feed, James spotted Travis idling 3 houses down, parked at an angle where he could see their front door. Sarah, now fully convinced the man was escalating, called in a quiet favor to a colleague at the sheriff's office to run a check on Travis' concealed carry license. The result came back quickly. Expired 3 years ago, and no registered permit in the current county. That alone could have been enough to bring charges. But Sarah wasn't ready to make her move. Not yet. She wanted the board, the full picture, the whole cancer cut out, not just the tumor. The opportunity came at the next HOA board meeting. Officially, it was a public session held every month at the community center. But unofficially, it was a carefully choreographed show of force where dissenters were drowned out by technical jargon and meaningless resolutions. Sarah and James arrived early, dressed like ordinary residents. Jeans, polos, a clipboard for note-taking. The board sat on a raised platform at the front. 5 individuals, all smiling tightly, flanked by a table with a coffee urn, printed agendas, and a conspicuously placed sign reminding attendees to respect the integrity of community governance. Travis stood near the back, arms folded, scanning the crowd like a watchdog. The meeting began innocuously enough, with discussions on water conservation, minor budget reallocations, and fence repainting schedules. But when the floor opened for community questions, Sarah stood up. "My name is Sarah Lane," she said calmly. "I've lived in the neighborhood for just under a month. and I've already received 3 notices and a warning for my landscaping. I'd like to know why." A silence fell over the room. The board president, a wiry man named Glenn Garrison, smiled with professional condescension. "Mrs. Lane, as you know, our community standards are clearly outlined in the welcome packet." "I read them," Sarah interrupted. "Nowhere does it prohibit lavender, nor does it authorize armed patrols of civilian property." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Travis shifted slightly, now staring directly at her. "Mrs. Lane," Garrison began again, now with visible strain, "this is not the time or place to challenge the policies that keep this community safe." Sarah took a step forward. "You're absolutely right," she said. "Which is why I'm not challenging the policies. I'm challenging the people who are abusing them." James rose beside her and placed a printed packet on the table before the board. It included copies of bank statements, vendor payments, screenshots of internal emails, and stills from the body cam footage. The room grew dead quiet. Sarah waited a beat, then reached into her jacket and calmly pulled out her badge. "Sheriff Sarah Lane," she said. "Effective immediately, this meeting is being observed as part of an ongoing investigation into potential fraud, misconduct, and impersonation of law enforcement." The board froze. Travis stiffened like someone had fired a gun behind him. "You're lying," he blurted, his face flushing red. "This is a setup." Sarah turned to him, slow and deliberate. "Mr. Denton," she said, "I have your expired permit records. I have video evidence of you threatening minors. I have proof that you are receiving unreported payments through a shell landscaping company owned by a board member's relative. Sit down." For a moment it looked like he might bolt or lunge, but then the weight of the moment settled on him like wet concrete. He sank slowly into a folding chair at the back, breathing hard. The board stammered, tried to regain control, but the room had shifted. Residents were pulling out phones, whispering, nodding. A wave had begun, and it wasn't one the board could stop. Sarah didn't arrest anyone that night. She didn't need to. She had shown the badge, dropped the file, and made it clear that the system they had built on fear, intimidation, and fraud was no longer protected by shadows. When she and James left the meeting, the crowd parted around them, some silent with shock, others with cautious gratitude. Back home, Sarah filed an official report with the district attorney's office, triggered a formal audit request through the State Compliance Bureau, and sent a sealed evidence file to Internal Affairs with an accompanying letter outlining the charges she intended to pursue. The hunt was over. The case had begun. But in the quiet of their living room, lights low, the smell of evening coffee drifting through the house, Sarah looked at James and said quietly, "They're going to fight back. This won't be clean." He nodded, rubbing her shoulder gently. "They have no idea who they picked to fight with." Outside, the streetlights buzzed over identical driveways and mailboxes. But something fundamental had changed in Silver Pines. The facade of order had been pierced, and behind it, a reckoning had begun. The air was thick with tension in Silver Pines as summer crept toward its height, the humidity clinging to every porch rail and mailbox like a prelude to something long overdue. For Sarah and James Lane, the weeks since the explosive HOA board meeting had passed not with ease, but with the quiet intensity of a coiled spring. The exposure had rippled through the neighborhood, drawing hushed conversations behind fences, cautious glances at the couple who had dared to challenge the unspoken authority that ruled the streets. Yet Sarah didn't slow down. She accelerated. Every free hour was consumed in coordination with her contacts. The district attorney's office, the county police department, the State Bureau of Investigation. What had started as a quiet probe into a single HOA officer's misconduct had grown into a full-blown criminal case, implicating an entire network of complicit board members, shell corporations, and fraud schemes masked as neighborhood compliance initiatives. Sarah wasn't just building a case, she was planning a reckoning. The final blow would have to be precise, legal, and public. She wanted the arrest to happen not behind closed doors, but in the bright, sanitized light of a neighborhood so obsessed with appearances that they'd ignored the rot festering in their own leadership. She wanted the lies scrubbed away in front of the very people who had been silenced. And so, Operation Clean Sweep was born, not the title anyone would use in the official court filings, but the one Sarah and James whispered to each other late at night as they mapped out the play on whiteboards in their office. Travis Denton, the self-appointed security chief, was scheduled to conduct a neighborhood compliance sweep on the first Saturday of the month. The HOA had made it a routine fixture, one no longer questioned, Denton walking the streets with his pseudo-police vest, clipboard in hand, sometimes armed, snapping photos of violations. Like minor fence discoloration or a parked truck with its tire just touching the grass. That routine, Sarah decided, would be his undoing. The plan came together with ruthless precision. Sarah coordinated with Lieutenant Haskins of the County Sheriff's Department, a longtime colleague who knew how to run clean field ops and wasn't squeamish about taking down a fellow enforcer who'd gone rogue. The district attorney's office cleared the warrants with a judge 3 days prior, under seal to prevent leaks. Subpoenas had already harvested the HOA's financial records, and forensic accountants corroborated the laundering activity Sarah suspected. She had her timeline, her witnesses, the surveillance, the financials, and the video evidence, including new footage from several other residents who had come forward once they saw that Sarah wasn't just another homeowner. But what made it perfect, what gave Sarah the cold? Quiet satisfaction of knowing this was more than justice, it was poetic, was that she had arranged for the bust to happen mid-sweep, in uniform, in front of the very homes Travis had used as a stage for his intimidation. Saturday dawned hot and still, the sky a pale, cloudless blue that offered no comfort from the rising heat. Sarah dressed in full tactical uniform, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to remind everyone watching exactly who she was. Her badge gleamed under the rising sun, her utility belt tight with cuffs, radio, and sidearm. She met the task force in the community center parking lot, now serving as staging ground. 3 unmarked units, 2 black SUVs with SBI agents, and 1 official county patrol cruiser to make the authority impossible to ignore. She briefed them quickly, professionally, names, locations, arrest orders, expected resistance level. Travis Denton was to be approached first, neutralized swiftly before he had a chance to escalate or reach for a weapon. The others, Garrison, the HOA president, along with Treasurer Cindy Dobbins and Secretary Paul Liu, would be detained simultaneously at the HOA office where all were scheduled to be processing Denton's report by mid-morning. At 9:17 a.m., everything moved. Denton was halfway through harassing a family about unauthorized solar lights when the first cruiser rolled up behind him. He didn't notice it at first, too busy lecturing the teenage daughter about regulation bulb lumens, but he stiffened when he heard the unmistakable voice of Sarah Lane call out from behind him, "Travis Denton, hands where I can see them." For a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze. Residents peeked from windows, front doors slowly cracked open. Denton turned, his hand instinctively brushing his hip, but 2 SBI agents were already behind him, weapons drawn, calm but firm. "Don't do it," Sarah warned, stepping forward. "We've got you on 3 angles. Weapon drop will result in escalation." Something flickered in Denton's eyes. Panic, disbelief, fury. But he wasn't stupid. He froze, then raised his hands slowly, the clipboard falling to the grass beside him. Sarah crossed the distance between them, locked one cuff around his wrist, twisted his arm back, and finished the arrest. "Travis Denton, you are under arrest for impersonating a law enforcement officer, brandishing a firearm during a civil enforcement, criminal harassment, and receiving fraudulent compensation through unlicensed channels. You have the right to remain silent." As she recited the Miranda warning, cameras from stunned neighbors flickered to life. Some recorded openly. Others just stared, mouth slightly open. A child clapped. Denton didn't say a word as he was escorted to the SUV. Though his face twisted into a mask of rage. The illusion had broken, and he knew it. Meanwhile, at the HOA office, arrests 2, 3, and 4 unfolded with mechanical efficiency. Garrison had barely opened the laptop on the oak conference table before 2 uniformed officers entered and informed him that he was under arrest for wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. Cindy tried to protest, sputtering about misunderstandings and bookkeeping errors. But she was cuffed mid-sentence, her designer sunglasses slipping from her hair as she was led out the back door. Paul Liu simply raised his hands and muttered, "I knew this would catch up with us." By 10:04 a.m., all 4 were processed and in transport to the county holding facility. At 10:30, Sarah held a press conference on the steps of the community center. She didn't gloat. She didn't posture. She laid out the facts. An HOA that had engaged in targeted harassment, financial manipulation, and the illegal impersonation of law enforcement authority. Board members who had funneled community dues into private accounts. Weapon drop will result in escalation. Something flickered in Denton's eyes. Panic, disbelief, fury. But he wasn't stupid. He froze, then raised his hands slowly, the clipboard falling to the grass beside him. Sarah crossed the distance between them, locked one cuff around his wrist, twisted his arm back, and finished the arrest. Travis Denton, you are under arrest for impersonating a law enforcement officer, brandishing a firearm during a civil enforcement, criminal harassment, and receiving fraudulent compensation through unlicensed channels. You have the right to remain silent. As she recited the Miranda warning, cameras from stunned neighbors flickered to life. Some recorded openly. Others just stared, mouth slightly open. A child clapped. Denton didn't say a word as he was escorted to the SUV, though his face twisted into a mask of rage. The illusion had broken, and he knew it. Meanwhile, at the HOA office, arrests 2, 3, and 4 unfolded with mechanical efficiency. Garrison had barely opened the laptop on the oak conference table before 2 uniformed officers entered and informed him that he was under arrest for wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. Cindy tried to protest, sputtering about misunderstandings and bookkeeping errors. But she was cuffed mid-sentence, her designer sunglasses slipping from her hair as she was led out the back door. Paul Liu simply raised his hands and muttered, "I knew this would catch up with us." By 10:04 a.m., all 4 were processed and in transport to the county holding facility. At 10:30, Sarah held a press conference on the steps of the community center. She didn't gloat. She didn't posture. She laid out the facts. An HOA that had engaged in targeted harassment, financial manipulation, and the illegal impersonation of law enforcement authority. Board members who had funneled community dues into private accounts. A security officer who was never licensed and had pulled weapons on multiple unarmed civilians, including minors. The final words she spoke before stepping away from the microphone rang with quiet finality. This community was not protected by these individuals. It was preyed upon. That ends today. The fallout was swift. By Monday, the court had ordered the immediate dissolution of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association, citing systemic abuse of power, financial irregularities, and the endangerment of residents. An independent trustee was appointed to manage the transition, and residents were informed that all pending fines, liens, and violations issued under Denton's or the board's authority were voided. Some cried. Others hugged each other in relief. Collins, the retired Marine who had first shared footage with Sarah, dropped off a bottle of whiskey and simply said, "Semper Fi." Even the kids started playing outside again, their basketballs echoing down the street without fear of sudden gun threats or made-up infractions. And yet, amid the relief, Sarah and James knew this wasn't the end. Not entirely. There would be depositions, trials, and possibly appeals. The local news had already started spinning it as the HOA sting, and national outlets were sniffing around. But at the core of it all was something simpler. The restoration of dignity to a neighborhood that had been bullied into silence. For James, the moment that sealed it wasn't the arrests or the press conference. It was when he overheard a small boy biking past their house, shouting to a friend, "That lady's the real sheriff. She got rid of the fake one." Sarah, standing just inside the screen door, smiled softly and turned back to her coffee. For all the tactics, planning, and courtroom filings, sometimes justice looked like a kid on a bike finally able to ride in peace. That night, Sarah sat on the porch with James beside her, watching as porch lights flickered on one by one across the neighborhood. She had restored more than law, she had restored safety, sanity, and truth. But as she looked out at the freshly calm streets of Silver Pines, she knew something else too. If it ever happened again, if power tried to rise unchecked, cloaked in policy and false authority, she'd be ready. After all, she'd faced down the worst the HOA had to offer and not only survived, she had won. And there was no board meeting, no fine, no fake badge in the world that could take that from her now. The morning air felt different now, lighter, as if the very atmosphere of Silver Pines had exhaled a breath it didn't realize it had been holding for years. Sunlight crept across dew-slick lawns and tidy driveways, no longer scrutinized through the lens of arbitrary compliance codes, no longer measured for shade angles or front yard ornament density. Children played without whispered warnings to stay off the edge of the grass, elderly couples walked in peace, and the neighborhood, once tense with invisible strings of control and manipulation, had finally begun to feel like a community instead of a courthouse. For Sarah Lane, the final chapter of the ordeal wasn't about punishment, it was about rebuilding. Not bricks and mortar, but trust, fairness, accountability, the intangible cornerstones of real peace. The arrests had made headlines, both local and national, with outlets zeroing in on the surreal irony of a fake HOA enforcer pointing a weapon at the county's real sheriff. Reporters had camped outside the gates for a week, clamoring for interviews, trying to spin soundbites and buzzwords out of the layers of corruption that had festered in one of the state's most affluent suburban neighborhoods. But Sarah, ever measured, ever poised, refused to let the narrative be hijacked. She agreed to exactly one press conference, not in uniform, not behind a podium ringed with logos or flags, but in front of the community center where the lies had unraveled, wearing a simple blouse and jeans, with James standing beside her and a dozen neighbors standing behind them. Her voice was steady, sincere, and devoid of any self-congratulatory tone as she spoke. Authority, she began, doesn't come from a title, a badge, or a uniform. It comes from accountability. It comes from serving, not ruling. And it requires one thing above all else: trust. What happened here in Silver Pines was a betrayal of that trust. But what comes next can be a restoration of it if we do the work together. The crowd was silent for a beat, absorbing the weight of her words, and then the applause began, not the wild, celebrity kind, but the kind that comes from people who have lived through something together and finally see the way forward. That moment marked the true end of the HOA's tyrannical reign, not the clink of the last jail cell door or the final gavel in court, but a collective realization among the residents they had allowed fear and false authority to rule their lives, and they would not make that mistake again. The court had issued a permanent injunction dissolving the Silver Pines Homeowners Association, transferring interim governance to an independent trustee team responsible for disbursing funds, untangling contracts, and handling restitution claims. But Sarah knew that governance couldn't just be handed over to another rigid system. It had to be earned. So she and James hosted the first community assembly on their own lawn, folding chairs in neat rows, coffee and lemonade on the porch, no mics, no official station, just people. Dozens showed up, some hesitant, others eager, all curious about what a voluntary community council could look like. The idea was simple: no fines, no punishments, no hidden covenants buried in unread contracts. Just a transparent advisory group that helped mediate disputes, organize events, and represent the majority consensus without forcing it down anyone's throat. Everyone would have access to meeting notes. Every dollar spent would be publicly recorded. And no one, not one soul, would carry a badge that hadn't been issued by the county. That first meeting turned into something remarkable. People who had lived next to each other for years without more than a nod or wave now exchanged full conversations. They brought ideas, real ones. Mrs. Huang suggested a monthly community cleanup. A teenage girl named Aaliyah proposed a mural wall by the community center that anyone could contribute to. Mr. Patel offered to start a composting program. None of these things would have passed under the old HOA, strangled by codes and approval forms. But now they thrived. Elections for the voluntary council were held in the most democratic way possible, on index cards slipped into a simple box labeled "Neighbors Helping Neighbors." Sarah was nominated unanimously and declined with a smile. This was never about power, she told them. It was about breaking it. I'm always here, as your neighbor and yes, as your sheriff, but it's time for someone else to lead this chapter. In her place, James was elected council chair, not because of the viral videos or his quiet dignity through the ordeal, but because people respected the way he had never made it about himself, the way he had listened, reasoned, and believed in better without needing a badge to do it. The rest of the council included Mrs. Ramos, who'd once received 3 warnings about her holiday wreaths, Tyler, a wheelchair-bound veteran who had sued the HOA for access to the pool, and Lena, a schoolteacher who had been fined for using an eco-friendly clothesline. The very people who had been marginalized were now guiding the future, and that, more than anything, proved the transformation was real. As for Travis Denton, his trial had concluded with a string of guilty verdicts: impersonation of a law enforcement officer, assault with a deadly weapon, fraud, and conspiracy to intimidate under color of authority. His defense had tried to paint him as a misguided patriot, someone filling in the gaps left by an overburdened sheriff's department. But the jury didn't buy it. Video after video showed a pattern not of civic duty, but power, lust, and intimidation. Sarah testified only once, giving crisp, concise answers without dramatization. She didn't need to embellish. The facts spoke louder than any emotion ever could. Travis was sentenced to 8 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 5. When asked if she felt justice had been served, Sarah said only, "Justice isn't about vengeance. It's about preventing the same harm from happening again." And so, Travis faded into obscurity, his name spoken less and less around Silver Pines, his former reign reduced to cautionary tales and the occasional shake of the head. The badge he had once flaunted in leather holsters now gathered dust in an evidence locker. The vest hung in a prison property room, unclaimed and unloved. But the community didn't rebuild itself solely on reforms and policy. It grew through something even more powerful, reconnection. Street barbecues returned, potlucks filled the weekends, and spontaneous soccer games broke out in cul-de-sacs once ruled by silence. Sarah and James, though still treated with deep respect, were no longer gawked at or separated by invisible lines of reverence. They were truly part of the fabric again. One morning, as they sat on the porch sipping coffee and watching joggers pass by, Sarah turned to James and said, "I don't think I've ever heard birdsong this clearly here before." James smiled, nodding. "That's because it was always drowned out. Now we're just finally listening." And he was right. The entire neighborhood had been so obsessed with order, perfection, and appearance that it had become deaf to the quiet beauty around it. But now, with the fear gone, the laughter rising, and children free to explore without restraint, it was like living in color after years of grayscale. The mural wall bloomed with color, splashy, uneven, raw, and beautiful. Stories emerged on its bricks, a firefighter helmet painted next to a quote about courage, a mother holding a child's hand under a tree, a cracked scale of justice slowly being stitched back together by golden thread. Every month a new panel was added. Every voice mattered. And perhaps the most symbolic of all, someone had painted a depiction of Sarah in uniform, not striking a pose or holding a weapon, but standing with one hand on her heart, the other resting gently on a neighbor's shoulder, surrounded by the words, "Real authority protects. It never pretends." She didn't know who painted it. No one claimed it. But when she passed it on her evening walks, she always paused for just a second, not for vanity, but to remember why she had taken that stand. Not because she was a sheriff, but because she was a neighbor. In the years that followed, Silver Pines became a case study in community transformation. Universities cited it in urban sociology courses. A documentary was produced, nothing flashy, just interviews, footage, and quiet narration about what happens when power is left unchecked and how communities can reclaim their voice. But inside the gates, it wasn't about publicity. It was about peace. A little girl sold lemonade from a cart once fined for commercial use. Retired veterans sat in lawn chairs swapping stories instead of grievances. And Sarah Lane finally got to live the life she and James had envisioned when they first moved in, not as silent occupants in a rule-obsessed complex, but as part of something truly shared. On the anniversary of the day Travis pointed that gun, the day everything changed, the community held a gathering not to relive the fear, but to celebrate the courage that came after. A new plaque was unveiled at the community center. It read, "To the neighbors who stood up, spoke out, and stayed strong, this is your home. Let no one take it from you again." Sarah stood in the crowd, not in front, not spotlit, but in the middle, her hand in James's, surrounded by friends, laughter, and light. No badge, no titles. Just a heart that had stood firm, a mind that had remained clear, and a home that had finally, fully become free.